The Vietnam War, a battle of ideologies and the cost of superpower rivalry dive into the proxy war, global politics, and lasting trauma. The Vietnam War was more than just a regional conflict. It was a clash of ideologies, communism versus capitalism. A proxy war between global superpowers, and a tragic chapter in modern history that left deep scars across nations and generations. The roots of conflict. The promised elections of 1956 never materialized. South Vietnam's president, Ngo Dinh Diem, with backing from the United States, refused to participate, fearing a likely victory for Ho Chi Minh and the communists. Diem's regime quickly became repressive, targeting political opponents, Buddhists, and anyone suspected of communist sympathies. In the eyes of many in the South, Diem was less a liberator than a dictator. In the North, Ho Chi Minh and his government intensified efforts to unify the country, not through diplomacy, but through armed struggle. With support from China and the Soviet Union, the Viet Minh transitioned into the Viet Cong, a guerrilla insurgency operating in South Vietnam. By the late 1950s, South Vietnam was slipping into chaos. Assassinations, bombings, and uprisings became common. The US, alarmed by the spread of communism in Asia, began sending military advisors, first hundreds, then thousands, and so began America's long descent into war. President John F. Kennedy believed Vietnam was a test of American resolve. By 1963, over 16,000 US military advisors were stationed in South Vietnam, but the situation on the ground continued to deteriorate. That same year, Diem was overthrown and assassinated in a military coup, one quietly approved by the United States. His death, however, plunged South Vietnam into further instability, as a carousel of weak and corrupt leaders followed. In the Gulf of Tonkin incident, American naval ships were allegedly attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats. In response, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving President Lyndon B. Johnson broad authority to use military force in Vietnam. By 1965, American combat troops were on the ground. The war was no longer covert. The United States was now fully engaged in one of the most controversial conflicts in its history. But Vietnam was unlike any war the US had fought before. There were no clear front lines. The enemy moved through villages and jungles, blending in with civilians. Guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and booby traps took a heavy toll on American troops. Meanwhile, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a vast supply route through Laos and Cambodia, kept the North Vietnamese forces well armed and ever present in the south. Despite overwhelming firepower, high-tech weaponry, and massive troop deployments, the United States found itself locked in a grinding, unwinnable war of attrition, and the world was watching. The domino theory and American involvement. To American leaders, Vietnam wasn't just about Vietnam. It was about the bigger picture, a world divided by ideology. The fear was rooted in the domino theory. If one nation in Southeast Asia fell to communism, others would soon follow. One by one, they'd tumble, undermining American influence and emboldening the Soviet Union and China. For the United States, Vietnam became a symbolic and strategic battleground. A place to prove that democracy, and American resolve, would not falter. Successive presidents, each believing in the urgency of the moment, escalated U.S. involvement. Dwight D. Eisenhower provided financial and advisory support. John F. Kennedy increased the number of military advisors. Lyndon B. Johnson, after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, made the war official. By 1965, full-scale war was underway. American forces brought overwhelming firepower to Southeast Asia. Napalm, a jellied gasoline, turned jungles into infernos. Agent Orange, a toxic herbicide, was sprayed to strip away cover, but poisoned the land and its people. Helicopter assaults, once hailed as cutting-edge mobility, became symbols of a war with no safe zone. Search and destroy missions were launched to root out Viet Cong fighters hiding among civilians. Guerrilla ambushes and deadly booby traps made every step through the jungle a gamble with death. But despite advanced weaponry and hundreds of thousands of boots on the ground, the US struggled to gain control. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army were not just soldiers. They were nationalists, deeply committed to reunifying their country, at any cost. And while the United States measured progress in body counts, its enemy measured it in willpower and survival. The Cold War's hottest front behind North Vietnam stood two communist giants, the Soviet Union and China, both eager to support fellow revolutionaries in their fight against Western imperialism. They supplied weapons, ammunition, and military advisors, keeping the communist war machine running. Behind South Vietnam stood the United States, armed not only with the most advanced military technology in the world, but with a belief that it was fighting for freedom, democracy, and the containment of communism. Vietnam became the Cold War's hottest front, a proxy war in the truest sense. A war not for land, but for the future of global ideology, capitalism versus communism. Democracy versus dictatorship. Freedom versus totalitarianism. But on the ground, the reality was far more complicated. Many South Vietnamese civilians were caught between two forces, neither of which fully represented their interests. The government in Saigon, though supported by the West, was riddled with corruption and authoritarian practices. Dissent was crushed. Elections were manipulated. Basic services failed to reach rural villages, where poverty and resentment festered. For many in the countryside, the communist message of land reform, independence, and national unity resonated more deeply than the empty promises of distant officials. In truth, this was not just a Cold War confrontation. It was also a civil war. A war for self-determination, for national identity, and for a vision of what post-colonial Vietnam should become. The war at home. Back in the United States, the war was no longer just a distant conflict, it was in people's living rooms. Televised combat footage, graphic images of wounded soldiers, body bags, and burning villages played nightly on the news. The war's reality was unfiltered, raw, and deeply unsettling. As casualties mounted and military victories remained elusive, a growing sense of futility and betrayal began to seep into the national consciousness. What had once been framed as a noble fight for freedom and democracy now looked like a bloody, senseless quagmire. The anti-war movement began to swell. It started with students on college campuses, questioning the draft and the morality of the war. Then came veterans, many disillusioned by what they had seen and done. Even civil rights leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke out, connecting the struggle in Vietnam to injustice and poverty at home. Protests erupted across the country, marches on Washington. Sit-ins at universities, flags burned. Draft cards destroyed. The iconic chant, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" echoed in the streets. The nation was deeply divided, between generations, between those who served and those who resisted, between faith in government, and a growing movement of dissent. America was fighting a war abroad, and a battle for its soul at home. The cost of rivalry. The war dragged on, year after year, with no end in sight. In sheer scale and destruction, it surpassed all expectations.